Hi, okay, so let's keep going by talking about political reforms. And I want to apologize. I posted a bunch of stuff yesterday but forgot to activate the page on Haiku. Just realized it, and now it is Wednesday night. So you're getting these videos on the later side, and I'm gonna keep recording them. But for the fishbowl tomorrow, just realize that you're asking questions based on what you're already familiar with. So we can really generate a discussion based on progressive era politics. Okay, and not even all of them, of course, for that matter, since we're still going. So, in any event, continuing on with political progressivism, one of the really, really important elements of progressivism was increasing the access to democracy, would be the best way to describe it. There was a desire among all progressives to increase political participation in the government and eliminate corruption in politics. So there were political reforms that largely started more at the municipal and state level, and then gradually over time, they rose to affect the federal level. And I discussed it in the previous video with amendments, and that would be one of the best examples of a federal policy, or in this instance, a progressive policy. So, the Australian ballot. It's just this. It's a secret ballot. We never really refer to it by that term, but prior to this new introduction, votes were not secret, and parties or machines could manipulate voters and intimidate voters. That was legal. And the new system required all voters to mark their choices in a private booth. And that was a really significant accomplishment that we still have and should really value today. And these were adopted nationwide by 1910. Direct primaries were another example. And so nominations for president and other major candidates, such as senator, you have a primary election before you have the general election, which is typically in the fall. And the nominations used to take place in conventions, and they were also dominated by party bosses. So there was a lot of corruption in politics. But the direct primary, it was introduced by Robert La Follette, who was the governor of Wisconsin, and the nominating process was after this, and still is directly in the hands of voters. So now, even though the primary process varies drastically by state, and also certain states use a caucus system, this is still a significant expansion of democracy that we did not previously have. Uh, there was still a limited effect on curbing the influence of machines and bosses because they still would use money to accomplish their means, but this still was a very significant achievement nonetheless. And some states still held white only primaries to keep African Americans from voting, so this does not at all suggest that there was absolute democracy after this. And also direct election of senators that was accomplished through the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913. Prior to this, if you remember, with the ratification of the Constitution, senators were chosen by the state legislature, so they were never directly elected. And that was a limitation of democracy, one might say. And progressives denounced this process, and they pointed out that the Senate was increasingly becoming a what they called a millionaires club, which was dominated by business. All too telling if we think about the current day. And in 1913, as I said, the 17th Amendment was ratified. A significant achievement, of course, because that took two-thirds of the states to agree to that. Initiative, referendum, and recall. You guys, this is way more detailed than you'd ever have to worry about for this unit, of course, as we know, because we're not tested on it. But this is, if you're really interested in democracy and you're thinking about taking AP Gov next year, you should really just keep listening in on this. So, initiative um, is a method by which voters can compel the legislature to consider a bill. So, in other words, if you think about taking the initiative to do something, it's sort of having the gusto to make a move, right? To advocate, to take action. And so, initiative is a democratic process by which, if you want action, right, you could actually bring it to your city hall, you could bring it to your representatives, and that might eventually become a bill. Um, Referendum is more of a direct vote, one could say, one of the purest forms of democracy left. Citizens can vote directly on a proposed law. We talked about some examples of referendums in class, if you recall. Speaking of recall, not the same use of the word. This actually enables voters to remove a corrupt or unsatisfactory politician from office by majority vote before the official's term has expired. So it's not the exact same thing as an impeachment because the process is different, but it actually is a greater democratic process than impeachment because this directly involves the voter. So you can see all across the board on this slide there are some significant democratic achievements during the progressive era. Okay, back to women's reform. We actually did this slide in class, so just as a reminder, settlement homes, Jane Addams, right? And if you forget or you weren't here, you can just pause and take a moment. So let's just briefly touch upon the child labor reform and also just general women's involvement in the progressive era in this slide just briefly once again. So the National Child Labor Committee rather that was founded in 1904 proposed model state labor laws, and they were passed by 2/3 of the states by 1907, and they were significantly influenced by prior European child labor laws that date back to as early as the 1830s, I want to say. And they also established state compulsory school attendance laws that kept children out of mines and the factories and prisons for that matter. Mueller versus Oregon, which was what gave me pause and made me want to redo this slide, was a ruling that argued that women needed special protection from long hours. And the general argument behind that was that women were as seen as I forget the exact language, so I don't want to quote, but the reason why I put the bullet point down here is that ultimately the ramification of Mueller versus Oregon, many scholars have argued, is that it represents sex discrimination in the workplace because there's the interpretation that women are seen as more fragile or vulnerable on the job. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was a tragedy that took place in 1911. It was a garment factory in New York City that was very overcrowded and did not have very safe conditions, and also people oftentimes smoked on the job in those days. The factory caught fire, and there were not sufficient fire escapes, and the elevator stopped working, and many women ended up leaping to their death from this building, and you can see that in this photograph here. 146 women were killed, or workers rather. There were a few men, but most of them were women. Were killed in this tragedy, and ultimately the photos that were taken of the event, of the victims in particular, sparked greater women's activism and motivated states to pass laws and improve safety and working conditions in factories. Another interesting thing I might add with this event is that the vast majority of the women working in these factories were immigrants. Most of them were of Eastern European and often Jewish descent. One of the negative reform effects of all of these reforms, I touched upon this briefly, was that it kept women out of some of the more physically demanding, but also higher paying jobs like mining. And later, the push to lift these restrictions on women have, in particular, the push for women to receive equal pay has still to this day received a significant amount of pushback. So, moving forward to the progressive presidents, let's actually take a pause here. It doesn't seem right to combine these guys in the same slide. So, brief part 2, and then we'll do part 3.